Yeah, welcome everybody to another one of our Thirsty Thursday panel sessions. These sessions are designed obviously to keep everybody connected during these difficult times, for everybody to learn, take advantage of the depth of knowledge that Rotary has access to, and have a little bit of fun. So today we have speaking to us Nicola Willis. So Nicola will speak on the topic of the role of the opposition during times of crisis. After her initial address, we'll open the floor up to questions. If you've got any questions, please send it directly through to me using the Zoom chat function, and then I will relay this question to the speaker. This is just to minimise the chaos that can occur with everybody trying to speak over each other at one point. Also, there's absolutely no need to wait to the end. If you send me a question during, while Nicola's speaking, I'll make sure that that's also included. So yes, today we have Nicola Willis. Nicola is a List MP based in Wellington and is National Spokesperson for Early Childhood Education and for Housing and Urban Development. She was born and raised in Wellington and has spent some time both in the public sector as a researcher and policy advisor for the Right Honourable Bill English. She's also served in the private sector working in Fonterra, both as its global director of global stakeholder affairs and as general manager for nutrient management. She's also served on the boards of Export New Zealand and the New Zealand Initiative. We're very, very lucky to have some of Nicola's time today, so we do appreciate that. I suppose without any real further ado, I will hand over the floor to Nicola for her time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Denise, and kia ora koutou katoa. It's great to see so many of you on the Zoom and many familiar faces, some of whom I've known since childhood, Mr. Ballard. So great to see you there, but you're not Pip, even though your Zoom says you are. And look, haven't we all got quite used to Zoom over the last few weeks? I think it's brought some great things, which perhaps some of you wouldn't have ventured out to a Rotary meeting if it meant climbing up the terrace and getting into your car, but you will do it if it's over Zoom. But on the other hand, I want to say that as a politician, I am very grateful that we can go back to having in-person catch-ups and meetings. And I'm sure you, like me, have enjoyed being able to see people and give them a hug where that's appropriate, shake their hand where that's appropriate, tap them on the shoulder, and never have I relished those opportunities so much as I have in the past few days. And certainly I thought that's where I'd start off in terms of giving you a bit of a view of what the experience of being an opposition MP during the COVID crisis has been like. It's just to start by stating the obvious, which is that as unnatural as it was for every New Zealander to find themselves at home, in isolation, cut off from usual services, it's very unusual for politicians too. A lot of our craft, a lot of our trade is done in informal ways. So actually going to the school fair or being at the market or going down to the shop to buy a cup of coffee is where we as politicians do a lot of our work, because we're much more approachable in those settings. While I hand my phone number out willy-nilly and anyone can email me anytime, I find that they're quite unlikely to do that. Most people won't ring me and say, you know, I'm really worried about issue X or I hate policy Y. But if they see me in the line at the supermarket, they'll absolutely start that conversation. And so one of the things I found really strange during the lockdown was being cut off from what I'd call those organic conversations. And I think my parliamentary colleagues on both sides of the House shared that experience. And so we're all very grateful to be back to our political campaigning ways and to be out there in the community, visiting people again. I'm looking forward to having my stall back at the Harbourside Market, and I'm even going door knocking this weekend because while I appreciate some people might still want to keep their physical distance, I can be 2 metres back on the doorstep, and that's going to be A-OK under Alert Level 1. So look, the actual experience for the opposition during the COVID crisis in a formal sense, of course, there's a couple of elements to that. The first is how we responded as an opposition to what was clearly a global crisis. And I think the thing that people perhaps forget looking back, is that we actually had a high degree of unity in New Zealand across the House about the need for New Zealand to go into lockdown. While there was debate at the margins about some issues and how they were managed, the week leading up to the full lockdown was one in which we actually saw politicians of all stripes recognising the fact that the borders needed to be fully closed and we needed to prevent community transmission from being home. So what I think that meant was we went into the crisis with a shared sense of objective, which was how do we protect New Zealanders from this virus? How do we reduce its impact and its transmission on the community? But of course, the minute we went into lockdown, there were a lot of unresolved questions, necessarily so. So, of course, officials hadn't worked through the details of how everything would work and what all the rules were. We were in absolutely uncharted territory. But what that did mean for MPs was that we faced a tsunami of constituent queries from people who wanted to know what the rules were, what it meant for them and how they'd apply. And so while we were locked at home with our families, certainly we weren't on holiday. Our jobs, in fact, became far more about those individual requests for information and those individual issues than perhaps is normally the case, where we're often dealing with bigger picture policy issues. So what happened pretty quickly, and you might be interested to know, was that all of us MPs getting phone calls from people needed a way to triage those requests. So the example I'd give you is here in Karori, where I live, our local Gyp Street butcher was on the phone to me saying, so am I going to be able to operate under lockdown? Am I an essential business? And I was unclear as to whether or not he was and needed to find out the answer. It transpired that he wasn't, but by the time we had that information locked down, he had bought several $1,000s worth of meat that he'd hoped to be able to sell in his community during the lockdown. So then we move into problem-solving mode and ask, well, what can we do for him? And as it transpired, as we worked through the process, he was able to keep selling that as a delivery-only business. But what we found with requests like this coming in, of course, just as I was asking about my local butcher, there were approximately 80 other MPs across the country asking about their local butcher or their local greengrocer and what the rules would be for them. And those questions have no political element. It's a simple factual-based thing. So whether you're a Labour MP, a National MP, a Green MP, when a constituent asks you for that information, you want to give them clear, accurate information. So the government, in response to that, followed the protocol that National had established during the Canterbury earthquakes, actually, of setting up what they called the Elected Officials Helpline. And what that was a dedicated email address and a dedicated phone number that we as MPs could call where we had requests for information that we were either unable to get clear guidance on or where we wanted clarity on what the guidance should be. And that line was incredibly helpful because it really served two purposes. The first was it meant that we could give out information confident that we were reflecting the government's intentions and purposes, which you'll all appreciate is very important. As an MP, you don't want to be giving out the wrong advice or getting people into legal difficulty or having them miss out on opportunities. But secondly, what it did was it highlighted for the government and for officials some of the recurring issues that were coming up and that required attention or where they had gaps in their policies or their information. So I think in that way there was a real grassroots element to the way that representation worked during the crisis, which was community brought their concerns to us and then we were able to elevate those concerns to government and the government was able to get a picture of where some of the issues in the community lay, and that was really effective. And in fact, that helpline was run, it turns out, and I didn't appreciate this at the time, by two people, Sam and Alma. And of course they were triaging, so a lot of the actual answers were given by officials from across government. I understand there were at least 120 people stood up in the Ministry of Health to help with these issues. But they were extraordinarily human and wonderful about the way they dealt with these requests, and it gave me great pleasure today, actually, to welcome them into my office, and we shared some Pravda cheese scones to say thank you for the way they dealt with these requests coming in. And I think it's just one of those small examples, and there are dozens across our community, of how people stepped up in a time of crisis, put politics to one side, and did what was best for the community. So that was really successful, and I'm happy to talk to you more about that. So that was just one insight I wanted to offer. The other thing, of course, that happened was that Parliament, in its usual form, was essentially suspended. It was inappropriate for 120 people to come together in close confines within the parliamentary chamber, and yet constitutionally there was still a very real need to ensure that we were providing scrutiny to some of the biggest government decisions in a generation. Suspension of people's freedom of movement and freedom of association, necessarily so, are big steps, and so the role for parliamentary scrutiny was still there. And so stepping through that with the Speaker, our then leader Simon Bridges came up with the solution, which was the COVID-19, the Epidemic Committee. And that committee met over Zoom, as you'll be aware, and its role was really to provide that opposition function, that democratic function of analysing some of the issues that were out there, holding the government to account where there were problems, asking questions, getting in alternative points of view, and bringing sunlight to some of the issues that were arising. And we'd argue in the opposition that it was a really effective way of just keeping the government on its toes and keeping it responsive. And we felt that as a stand-in for Parliament, it was pretty effective. But of course, ultimately, Parliament is still required. And we did, as we progressed through the lockdown, continue to have some of our select committees meeting over Zoom. So a really clear example of that is the Regulations Review Committee, of which I have been a member, I am no longer, which had that significant task of analysing some of the regulations that were created under the Epidemic Act to enforce some of the orders that were made around movement and to give the police their powers of enforcement. Some of you will be aware that public lawyers and others have had a few debates about the legality of those regulations and where they stood. So it was an example of where it was really important that select committees continued to meet in that way. So that went on. Then as we've moved through the alert levels, we've moved back into Parliament being able to sit, but still in a limited form. So even at alert level 2, we haven't been able to have all MPs sitting in the chamber. We are very conscious as MPs that we provide an example to others, and the image on the news of having 120 people shoulder to shoulder in Parliament wasn't one that we thought we could advocate for. And so we've had this unusual situation where Parliament's been sitting in all the normal ways, question time, debates in the House, but half the MPs have had to sit in the public galleries to take part in proceedings. And that, I have to say, has been very unusual, and you can imagine quite odd for the MPs up there in the gallery. And that was my experience on Budget Day. Rather than sitting in the chamber to listen to the Minister of Finance read his budget, I was sitting in the public gallery up above. So these are the sorts of modifications that have had to be made, and I think pragmatically so that we, like everyone else, have wanted to continue our business, but do so in a way that doesn't create undue health risks. So I'm happy to take quite a few questions about some of these technical issues and how we worked, but I think overall what I would say about operating as an opposition during a time of crisis is that more than ever, more than during peacetime, as it were, there is, I think, in a time of crisis, a shared set of motivations across the House. And that does dull down to quite an extent the politics you would normally see. because we did all share, as I say, that commitment to reducing the impact on the health of New Zealanders. And the debates we were having were at the margins rather than at the big picture. I've been one of the first to say that I am enormously grateful that New Zealand has come through with as few deaths and as little ill health as we have, and I commend the government for that result, and I think I commend all 5 million New Zealanders who've helped make that happen. We are, however, now in quite a different phase, and of course there's two things happening. The first is we're now very focused on economic recovery, and I would put forward the argument without politicising Rotary at all, but that is much more of a debate to be had about how we ensure economic recovery, and I think that we will see politics as usual resume a little bit more because of the nature of the different perspectives on that issue. And I think the other thing I'd say is we are now 13 weeks out from an election. So it's actually critically important for the good functioning of our democracy that the opposition use our voice, advocate for those in the community who don't feel listened to, and that we do offer alternative policy perspectives on the issues that we think aren't being addressed. So you will see more of that. I think the other thing that I can't go on this platform without saying is that I am really focused on Wellington's economic recovery. And I have been a little bit concerned to see how slowly some of us are in returning to our workplaces in the CBD. And my concern about that is simply about the economic ripples that's having across Wellington. Yes, it's our bars, our cafes, our retailers, and I am very concerned about them. I've had some of those businesses on the phone to me in tears. I had someone on the phone who has had a family business for 3 generations and they simply can't make the numbers work and are looking at closing it down. And I've had endless conversations with businesses really worried because even though they have the wage subsidy, they still have other bills to pay and they're worried about the viability. But it's not just those businesses you'd see on the ground floor, as it were. We also have to remember that for every high rise in this place, when it's not occupied by workers, whether those are public servants or whether those are employees in firms, there's also a whole chain of other businesses that support them that are out of work, whether it's the cleaners, the photocopy people, the people servicing the electricity wires. All of those people struggle when we're not back at work in the CBD. And there's a real debate, I think, to be had about how we get the balance right going forward. And I'd really appreciate your viewpoints and insights on that, because I absolutely understand the experience of many workers who've said, well, actually flexible working and working from home comes with some great benefits. And of course it does. But equally, the other side of that, which it does come with some risks, both to our wider economy, but also even just in terms of things like health and safety and people being able to be in a workplace where they're connected physically with their colleagues and where they're able to share and collaborate more easily. So I think there are some questions for Wellington as we go forward, and as I say, I'll wear my heart on my sleeve and say that I am very keen to see us back in our office buildings, getting that buzz of the CBD going again, because I worry about the impact on the jobs and livelihoods of many Wellingtonians if we're not. So that's just my pitch forward into what we're facing as we go ahead. But look, I'm really keen to hear your insights, your feedback, your questions, and very happy to tell more stories about some of the constituent queries I got during the crisis time, which varied from everything from people stuck on cruise ships to people like Colleen Singleton who were stuck in London, to, as I say, businesses struggling to pay the bills or struggling with enforcement of the regulations. So thank you for all being on the call, and I welcome your questions. Kia ora.
Jordan, if I might just for a moment, Nicola, you've done a terrifically skillful job of giving us an enormously informed view while staying within our Rotary protocols of being an apolitical discussion. Really helpful. And I just wanted to ask people if you could be please mindful of that convention in Rotary as you frame questions for the chat, to enable Nicola to give a response without leading her into territory that she doesn't want to go into. Thank you. Over to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Denise. Some questions I have here already. It's a bit of a long question, but hopefully you can get to understand where I'm sort of getting to with it, which is that many people might say sort of the ends have justified the means, and obviously that New Zealand has arrived somewhere well at the end of COVID relative to other countries. What difficulties are there in obviously challenging the decisions, such as length of lockdown, the rules at different levels, when there just isn't the data on what the alternative decisions would have led to? It's a bit of a guessing game there.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because that is the reality that any government managing COVID faces. First, that it is uncharted territory, it's a new virus. What the right approach is contested even within the scientific community. So one of the phrases that we've heard politicians across the world use is, "I'll be guided by the science," as if science is a monolithic thing in which all views are coherent and unified. And of course, that's not the case. There has been debate within the scientific community, and government ultimately has the role of working through that evidence, weighing it up, and making judgments. And that is what governments across the world have had to do. And there are no absolutes, because any decision comes with resulting impacts. And on the one hand, there will be a health impact of stopping the spread of COVID in the community, but we also always have to bear in mind the health impact of those people who are at home and isolated with significant mental health impact, those people whose elective surgery or cancer treatments may be delayed. We have to be aware of the impact that unemployment has on health dimensions across the board. And so any government, whether explicitly or implicitly, is making trade-offs and judgments about how to balance those things. So I'd first say that, and then the second part of that, I suppose, is the political element, which is at which point does the opposition question whether those balances and trade-offs have been struck properly. And of course, it's a real challenge, because the reality, as our leadership expressed, was that we didn't have access to the level of official advice that the government had at any one time, as is appropriate. But that does mean that there are challenges in questioning it. But equally, my view very much is that that doesn't mean that the opposition shouldn't question, because actually what we found was that we had questions coming through very strongly from the community, and we felt that we had a role, an important role, in putting those questions forward. And that's what the COVID committee provided a platform to do, was to put those questions forward. And I think actually that was very constructive, because sometimes framing those questions up did encourage the government to go away and have a look at those issues and respond better. So yes, difficult, sensitive territory, but still important that we didn't just accept that there was one way, the highway, the true way.
Fantastic, thank you, Nicola. What was, I suppose, the most unusual or bizarre query that you received or was privy to from a constituent?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm just going back in my mind thinking about some of the things that I got asked. One of the things we decided to do here in Wellington, as you'll appreciate, in the same way that Rotary has branches, the National Party has branches, and we have a Wellington Central branch. And my committee were very helpful in saying, well, what can we do to be supporting you as the MP to reach out to the community? And I had started making some phone calls to people I was aware of in the community who were either alone or not living with family, seniors in the community who I was concerned might not have help getting the groceries or might be feeling a bit cut off. And my committee came in behind and helped me make several thousand phone calls to people, particularly those over the age of 60, but also others, just to do a straight welfare check. That is, how are you doing? We're in lockdown. Is there anything that you have unanswered or that you need help with? And something that was really positive about that was, of course, the Student Volunteer Army here in Wellington, who were just incredible. And it meant that where people said, actually, yeah, I do need help getting the groceries, I didn't have to say yes in every instance, because doing 120 people's groceries might not have been practical for me. But I had somewhere I could refer them onto that I knew meant that they would get a trusted service. So that's not an unusual request. But what it did mean was that I had a broad range of conversations. And I think what I would say is that I had some highly unusual conversations with people who clearly had been at home by themselves for 30 days or more, and who just needed to have a chat. So we chatted about everything from the space race, to the dangers of vaccines, to what kind of gravel is used in the footpaths, through to what sort of planting should be occurring at the Botanic Gardens. And I found those conversations enriching.
Very good answer there. Thank you, Nicola. Do you expect to see any changes in the parliamentary processes, procedures, or its culture as a result of the whole COVID-19 experience?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that's what we're all working to do, isn't it, in our workplaces and in our communities, is say, well, what's the good we can take from this crisis that we've gone through and are now going through in terms of the economy, and what's the good we can take from it? What can we learn and do better? Certainly, I think we will see a more flexible approach to our work, and I would like to see Zoom being used more readily, particularly for select committees, which, while they do meet in different parts of the country, some submitters, I think, in the past have felt excluded from that ability to give oral submissions, because we just haven't been as geared up for that. It's been possible, but it's not been conventional, and I think we may see more of that in the future. I think also more of a willingness for people to meet in this way that we are now, and therefore to have more opportunities to get different groups of people together. Later tonight, I'm on a phone call, which I would never have done as a physical meeting, which is an egg chat with South Island farmers. It was started by a man during the lockdown from Timaru who wanted to chat with a few other people about what was going on for them. It's growing and growing and growing. A number of our MPs are involved. And I thought, well, why wouldn't I call in and see what our farming community is talking about? But I certainly wouldn't have flown down to Timaru for it. So I think the opportunity for us as representatives to be more engaged and more connected across a broader range of communities is certainly there.
Fantastic. What do you see, first of all, what is your view on the role of the CBD in enabling economic prosperity, not only in Wellington, but across, I suppose, the regions?
Well, I think CBDs are very important, and I absolutely appreciate the perspective that we also want healthy suburban communities. And as I said earlier, I'm a proud Karoriite, and I love our mountain village. I love the Karori Mall and shops. I love what's going on at Gyp Street, and they're important too. But look, the value of a CBD to me is partly about what it allows for us to have in terms of densification of housing and transport modes and servicing people from an urban development perspective. But it's also just about the reality of where we currently have density. This is in Wellington, the CBD is where we have our office blocks, it is where we have workers. And I think one of the great things about Wellington, and I really, really appreciated it when I lived in Auckland for several years, was in Wellington when you walk down Langton Quay, or you walk down the terrace, you walk down Featherston Street, you will bump into someone you know. And those bump conversations are great. Instead of having to host a formal meeting or make sure you're doing your regular call and catch up, you bump into someone, you say, have you heard about X? Oh yeah, I talked to Y. Why don't we get together and see if we can do A? And I think, you know, you hear that impact, that bump that we get in the CBD is beneficial to our creative communities. It's beneficial to our IT industry, it's beneficial to our entrepreneurial mindset. And so I think there is something special about the CBD. And I do think it's worth preserving. And so, as I say, that's why I am keen to see as many people as safely can do so come back to work here if that's an option for them.
Fantastic. Obviously, the lockdown was a very powerful intervention by the government, and it was an important decision to establish the COVID Select Committee. Do you think that was sufficient, or do you think perhaps Parliament should have continued in some form?
Look, I think that the COVID committee was the solution that we all came to at the time, that both sides could be happy with, that all people could be happy with, operating within the constraints that existed. A different crisis would require a different approach, because part of what drove the COVID committee was the need for physical distancing, yes, but also the inability to have domestic travel happening. Now, in a crisis where domestic travel is possible, I do think that, you know, it is preferable to have Parliament sitting. I do think that having the plurality of representation that Parliament provides is important. As a party, we were able to ensure that MPs from a range of communities and perspectives did have their say on the COVID committee, and that was significant. But of course, there's a reason we have a parliamentary democracy. Parliament's the best thing, but the COVID committee was the second best thing given the constraints we were facing. Jordan, you're on mute. You're doing the Zoom classic. We've all done it at least once. But actually, being on mute, I think, is less of a faux pas than the other one, which I think we've all done, which is where you've still got the camera on or you've still got the microphone on, and something escapes, as has happened to some politicians in high-profile ways over the past few weeks.
I certainly do agree with that. It's better of the two. Many businesses, especially hospitality, have struggled and will continue to struggle due to the lockdown rules. How does a party form policy on the balance between, obviously, health issues and also the very real economic issues?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have really seen that happening in Wellington, where, as you'll appreciate, we've had a number of hospitality businesses come under real pressure, and event venues come under pressure, retailers come under pressure, and the way up that I have seen and that I think National has articulated is, rather than having blanket rules that ban and say you can't do, the focus should be on what can you do while being safe, so that we allow innovation and allow people to do things safely. Of course, we're now out of those alert levels. We're now in a situation where business can get back to usual. But our argument has been that could have happened a bit sooner. And the way up that we've made has been about what is the genuine and actual risk of community transmission. And in the case of Wellington, for example, it has been 40 days since there was a case of community transmission. I think I want to go and check that number actually. I take that back, but there was a long period of time where community transmission wasn't occurring, and where, you know, it's very difficult to have a conversation with a restaurant owner or a bar owner saying, I've got my life savings in this business, no one come in the door, but no one's going to get sick if they come in the door. And the balance that needs to be struck is between having clear rules, but also being alive to the fact that there are very real human consequences when businesses fall over. And it's not just about the business people, it's about the people who have full-time jobs who no longer will have the same income for their family. It's about the student whose part-time job disappears and who says, well, I can't actually afford to pay Wellington rent without that job, so I'm going to have to move home. It has a widespread impact. And I think some of that has been masked by the wage subsidy. National absolutely supported the wage subsidy because of its ability to help people get through this difficult period. But what we've got to hope over the next few weeks is that we do see some of those businesses bouncing back. And the reality, I think we all know, is that some of them won't.
It is a sad reality of it.
Mm.
One of the lifeblood items for our cities are students, and notably overseas students, the flow of which has stopped for understandable reasons. Do you have a view about the resumption of, when overseas students should be resuming back in New Zealand, and when?
Yeah,
So
well, look, students, as I said, both domestically are very important to Wellington, not only in terms of the economic benefit they bring, but frankly the vibrancy of Wellington. You know, part of what makes this a great city, I think, is that there are so many students and young people. We are one of the youngest electorates in the country, as I remind my colleagues who used to mock me for being the youth spokesperson at age 39. I said, well, I'm from a very youthful city. So partly there's that vibrancy, but from international students too, it's not just the economic impact, but it's the connections and the global connectedness that comes from having an international student population and the benefits that brings us across our Wellington economy. So we do want to see international students come back as soon as possible, and we think there's real potential for innovation there. Actually, New Zealand finds itself in quite an extraordinary position where, comparative to the rest of the world, we could be seen as a safe harbour, a good place to study. If you're a student wanting to go and study somewhere in the world, why wouldn't you choose COVID-free New Zealand with all of the benefits we have to offer? So the question for government, and I know that government ministers are also working through this, is how can we set that up quickly and safely? Because of course, if we are bringing people in from other countries, we don't want them to be putting our own population at risk, but we should be able to do that with good quarantine systems, good border checks, and good testing. So what I would like to see is that up and running as soon as possible for the economic benefit it will bring, but also because I think there is a first mover advantage here. If New Zealand can demonstrate we have a safely operating export education industry, then we could actually become a bit of a magnet for students from around the world. So from disaster can come opportunity.
Potentially follows up a little bit onto that question there, but at the moment it sort of feels a little bit like New Zealand's the bell on the ball, where we've come out and we have I suppose the option of expanding our bubble to include other countries. How do you think this sort of process should be handled in regards to obviously auditing, Australia or the Pacific Islands is the logical first steps, but to ensuring that we're not putting our own citizens at safety?
Well, look, we've been really clear that we would like to see a trans-Tasman bubble emerge as soon as possible. And the Pacific states, of course, have articulated that they see it as being absolutely critical that they can be part of an expanded trans-Tasman bubble. Because in the case of whether it's the Cook Islands or other countries, they really depend on travel between New Zealand and their countries from an economic perspective, but also from a family perspective and the way that those communities operate. So again, there is a need for urgency on these issues, because the longer we go with this highly unusual situation where cross-border travel can't happen, the deeper the economic wounds will be and the harder to repair from them. So we are very keen to see steps towards that trans-Tasman bubble progress as soon as possible, noting, of course, the other country has to be on board, Australia has to be on board, the Cook Islands have to be on board, and we have to be able to do it safely. But I think the sooner actually that the government can set out, here's the criteria that we're meeting, here's the timeline, here's what you can expect, the better, because there are all sorts of businesses and communities who will take a lot of confidence from seeing that timeline, and who will feel a lot better about the world if they can anticipate, for example, Australian tourists on the ski slopes or in their cafe or on their jet. So sooner the better. Safely, but soon.
I suppose during the absolute height of COVID, we've talked about the fact that a lot of decisions were made relatively quickly, and obviously with some limited information there. Is there any process being undertaken at the moment or upcoming to review those decisions that were made under COVID?
It's a really interesting question, because of course one of the rules of crisis management is to not defer decision making, that actually making decisions is very important, and you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And there's no doubt that looking back, there were decisions that were made imperfectly. We've seen that play out this week with the pretty disgraceful example of all of these modems and internet packs going out to school kids across the country at the cost of many millions, kids who didn't need those packs at all. And so there will have been mistakes that are made. So one of the things I really commend the government on doing is proactively releasing a lot of the official advice that they received during the crisis. We saw a lot of that information released, and I think that's quite an important democratic step, because it allows people to assess the information that ministers were making their decisions based on. And again, the reality is sometimes that information or advice was imperfect, and so we can understand that. In terms of a review, I would like to see a formal review done in time, because as I said earlier, I think it's critical that we learn from these kinds of crises, both in terms of how our governments responded, but also what we could do better in the future and what we might need to change about the way our structures and systems work, so that we're better equipped for whether it's a future pandemic or a future crisis that requires that same level of response.
What do you see, I suppose, as the top 2 to 3 challenges or barriers to opening up, or recovery, speeding up the recovery of the economy, and how could we, I suppose, as a country, alleviate those challenges and obstacles?
Well, of course, the first piece is technical, which is without a tourism industry and the thousands of jobs that provides and the thousands and the millions of dollars of export revenue, what ripple effect that has on the economy is as yet actually unknown. We've never been in a situation as a country where our tourism industries completely had to shut down overnight. And I think we're yet to see the full magnitude of the impact that will have. The second thing, and actually the third thing, is confidence. And that, I think, partly stems from what is going to happen with employment levels. The Treasury, perhaps optimistically, have estimated that unemployment will peak at 9.8%, whereas the Reserve Bank have imagined some scenarios where unemployment could get as high as 18%. And there are certainly bank economists out there who say that they think it will go higher than 10%. So whatever that number eventually is, even if it is 9.8%, that is still very high unemployment in the New Zealand context. And that has a massive impact, of course, for the families and individuals involved who will lose significant income and have a big impact. But I think it will also have a big impact on confidence. And so when I say the second and third thing, I think confidence is a big issue. Because people will be deferring decisions, whether they're investment decisions or expansion decisions, and that will have a ripple impact across the economy. I was in Auckland on Monday visiting new housing developments in my new portfolio, and one of the developers I spoke to said, look, prior to lockdown, we'd had dozens of people turning up on site to look at houses to buy off the plans. We'd already signed 10 people up. But now we haven't had anyone visit the site, and we've had people try and get out of their contracts. And when we ask them why, they say, look, it's not even that I've lost my job yet, it's just that I might, and if I do, then we wouldn't be able to service the mortgage. And so that confidence impact across the economy is something that we're yet to see play out. And I'm really interested to see how it plays. And fundamentally, I think it will be driven by those employment numbers.
I do have another question here, and you can, this one that you can actually, I suppose, decline to answer. But
I can always refuse to answer.
Yes, absolutely. But what difficulties were there, I suppose, in managing changes within your own party in the midst of a crisis?
Well, look, in terms of in the midst of a crisis, we weren't managing changes within our own party. I mean, during the crisis, as MPs, we did get together in caucus on the phone rather than on Zoom. We had conference calls reasonably regularly to check in on major issues and to ensure that there was information flow. as with all of you, we were on the phones to each other, on the email to each other, and those communication channels remained open. In the past few weeks, as we've obviously gone through a very public leadership change, we were actually out of the lockdown time, and we were back in the time where we could physically be together at Parliament. And so our leadership vote happened in a caucus room that was pretty normal, except that there were about 1.5 meters between the seats, which isn't usually the case. So to that extent, I wouldn't say that the two things interplayed that much. But just like everyone else from a workplace perspective, there's been a lot more talking on the phone than as usual.
Another question I had here is, how do you think, I suppose, the promotion of the training for a lot of the trades will impact your new portfolio within housing and urban development?
Well, look, I'm really pleased to see promotion of trades training. I think it's a good thing. One of the concerns I've had about fees free has been that the focus has been on tertiary, has been on university, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm always one to say, well, look around your neighbourhood. And actually, it's often the plumber or the builder who's the most entrepreneurial, who has a lovely big house and is doing very well. So kids, don't think that university is the only pathway to material success. There are other ways to ensure that, and New Zealand for several years has had critical skill shortages in lots of those trades-based areas. We hear that a lot when we go and visit our farming communities. You cannot go to a development site without the site manager saying to you, look, can you just help me get skilled people? I can't get subbies, I can't get trained builders, I can't get the people I need. So that is a major challenge for New Zealand, and it's clearly held back housing development. I think one of the things that the government was probably surprised by with Kiwi Build was that the constraints in terms of accelerating development were just so real in terms of those skill shortages. So I'm really pleased to see efforts to encourage more people into trades training. That certainly has national support as a goal. And at a time, of course, of increasing unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, we're seeing youth unemployment increase at a far more dramatic rate than that for older workers. We want to see those people given purpose and pathways back into employment, and trades training is a good way of providing that. So optimistically, if we do trades training right at this time of economic downturn, we should be able to provide a pipeline of skilled people for the future.